This is the Bizgnus Podcast, one-on-one conversations with experts in business and personal development.
Tom Fargnoli, a retired software and systems engineer and a former Catholic Church deacon, wants to see business leaders talking about suicide. Mr. Fargnoli married his high school sweetheart and had 2 children and 5 grandchildren, and then his life took a dramatic and totally unexpected turn. His wife took her own life. In this podcast, Tom Fargnoli tells how that suicide changed the direction of his life and what business leaders should be doing to help workers cope with similar circumstances. Tom, you have written a book with an interesting title, and we'll get to the background of that title in just a moment. But would you tell our viewers and listeners a little bit about your work background? You were once an engineer, is that correct?
Correct. I was a started out as a software engineer, which is a glorified name for a programmer back in the day. And then I moved into systems engineering. So we wrote the specs for the software engineering to program. So about 45 years in that field, and retired about 4 years ago.
Oh, very good. And your plan upon retirement was to become a deacon in the Catholic Church. Would you tell our audience about that progress?
Right. Well, to become a deacon in the Catholic Church, it takes about 6 years of formation, 6 years of study. In my case, it took just about 6 years, 5.5 years going every Saturday for a full day of classes all day. It was basically my plan to, when I retired, that I would, be a deacon. So I was ordained a deacon probably 3 months before I retired. So everything was set up to go smoothly. Now, a deacon in the Catholic Church is an ordained minister, but unlike a priest, they can be married. If they're married at the time they're ordained. If they're not married, then they can't get married. They have to take a vow of celibacy. And if you're already married, like I was, and 90% of deacons are married, they take a vow to say, listen, if my wife passes away, I will become celibate and not remarry.
You didn't expect that to happen, though, did you?
I did not.
Tell our listeners about that.
Yeah, in fact, when they told us that rule, the guys in my class, in my formation, we kind of made a little fun of it because we really didn't think that was going to happen. One of my fellow brothers, he said, well, can we date? And everyone laughed, because quite frankly, we didn't believe that would happen. Oddly enough, it was my wife who was against that rule from the beginning. I said, why would you be, against that rule? I'll probably die before you. I think most men feel that way. And she said, well, I just don't want you to be lonely. And so unfortunately, she did die.
And that brings us, Tom, to the crux of our conversation, and that is how she died and what you're doing since then.
Yeah. Well, it's unfortunate to bring up, when you bring up the word suicide, anytime you mention the S word, people kind of shut down by nature. Her brother, unfortunately, she was one of 9 Irish Catholics family, and her brother ended up taking his own life. And it was the first time anyone close to me or her we were ever exposed to suicide. And suicide is, when people hear it, they think that, it was a rational decision of some sort. But as we found out with my wife, it was really a hereditary mental disorder that led her to that pain, of which no one, even with the knowledge of her brother, no one even imagined my wife going that route. So it was quite a shock. All my plans, of course, to become a deacon and to go forward with traveling and retirement, everything kind of changed. And grieving your wife of 40 years is difficult. Suicide made it even more difficult because, again, people really did not want to talk about it, did not really want to address it.
Let me pursue this a little bit further with you, Tom. When you were a software engineer, systems engineer, et cetera, in business, working on your career, had you ever given any thought to your coworkers or anybody you worked around with, supervisors, et cetera, ever talk about suicide or recognize the problem?
In my field, no. I mean, it was one of those things that everyone kind of knew somebody who went that route or tried that route. So I did not have any direct experience with it. When my wife's brother ended up taking his life, that's when we first noticed people tend to shun away from discussing it at all. The only ones who really wanted to talk about it were ones who had the experience themselves of a loved one. In fact, they actually drew closer to people that had that experience because that was the one group that they felt, and I would say that we were the same way, felt that would understand. I mean, people meant well, but they just shied away. It's unfortunate because with that type of event, it's the event that people focus on and not the person herself or himself, which is unfortunate.
What happened at that point to your plans to become a retiree who was a deacon?
Yeah. Well, I guess in any stage of the stages of grief, I at first thought that it's business as usual for me. Unfortunately, now I'm alone. I had to have 2 children and 5 grandchildren, but for the most part now, I just plan my life going forward and being a deacon, and maybe putting more time into the church, to my ministry. That's the other thing about deacons. Not only do they assist the priest, but they have their own ministry. Mine was in the hospital. I loved going to the hospital and visiting, people in the hospital, doing magic for them, trying to cheer them up, and that kind of thing. So that was my initial stage, if you will. But then I found that this was a very lonely life for me. I always liked my being alone. I traveled a lot, teaching for Lockheed Martin, and I enjoyed being alone. My wife would go away or something for a weekend with her sisters. I welcomed, my being alone time. But this is different. Now I'm alone all the time. And I discovered a difference between being alone and loneliness. And quite frankly, what I really missed was the little things, the sharing, a dream I might have had. Who do you tell someone about a dream you've had, but your wife or someone you've had a relationship with for over 40 years? Because we met in high school. So eventually I came to a point where I started to think this isn't going to work for me. And it was a struggle because I had to make a decision. See, the church made it clear I couldn't go forward and possibly meet another person and have another relationship that would lead to marriage. I took that vow. I knew about it. It was no surprise to me. At least it wasn't a surprise up here. It was a surprise down here because the reality of it. So it took 2 years of this battle, praying and discerning, and was I called to be a deacon? Was I really meant to be alone? And after 2 years, I made my decision.
So when you quit being a deacon, I assume you send a letter of resignation into the boss somewhere, I guess. Give him 2 weeks notice, and you clean out the desk.
It's a little more complex. I know that
Probably would be, wouldn't it?
I had that experience in industry when someone leaves, and if they had a good reputation, they would throw a little party, and maybe a pizza party or cake, and wish them well. Not this time. First of all, I couldn't make this decision. It was very difficult for me. That's when I started kind of seeing a counselor. It was driving me crazy. I just couldn't make a decision. And it was during that time that I ended up in the hospital with open heart surgery. And that's probably when I missed my wife the most, because now I'm recuperating from incredible surgery. And being alone during that recuperation is when I really made my decision. The decision was not met very with that, good luck, here's a pizza party. In fact, I met tremendous rejection from the church, priests, even some of my fellow deacons. They treated me as if the decision I made was a decision to leave the church. And that was never the case. I still have my faith, and I never left the church. I just decided that I wasn't meant to be alone for the rest of my life. And the first wave of that rejection came because when I couldn't even say my goodbyes. I couldn't even say, to my parish, who I served for 5 years, goodbye. It's been a pleasure. They didn't know what happened to me. I was told pretty much to disappear.
But you were a survivor of a suicide. Surely there must have been some level of counseling and warmth and support.
Not within, only those who were close to me. But the church, and again, they looked at this decision as something that, was something that I was treated as if it was scandalous. It's unfortunate, but that's how I was treated. Those who knew me, certainly the whole parish, where's Deacon Tom? What happened to him? Did his heart, you have another problem with his heart? Because when I was in the hospital, I had so many cards from my parish, but no, I was pretty much told to just kind of, and I guess their thinking was that the faithful might feel it may challenge their faith for some reason. I don't know how that could be. Anyone that didn't have a faith must have not. They could, look at me leaving because, I didn't want to be alone. And I took 2 years. It wasn't something I decided a month after my wife died. But in any case, that rejection was probably almost as bad, if not worse, than the grieving I did when my wife passed away. I just did not expect that.
Now, Tom, in your post-deacon life and post-suicide, you have launched into a campaign to help others understand the problems of suicide. Would you tell us what you're doing?
Well, first of all, with my book, The Deacon, An Unexpected Life, it started out not as a book. It started out as a cathartic exercise that my psychologist told me, write things down. Write things down about your grieving. Write things down about the rejection you felt from the church. Write all of this down. And I did. And, in talking with my current wife, Dorothy, uh, she said, a lot of people can benefit by this. First of all, to understand what you went through with suicide as a survivor. Secondly, to understand what you went through uh, with rejection, what you went through in your operation, in your recuperation. And yet, through all of these things, you maintained your faith. Now, other people maybe not didn't go through suicide, but they have had equally tragic events, and they probably would like to know how you held on to your faith. So that's when the focus switched from a cathartic exercise, if you will, to hey, let's write this book. And a few thoughts came to me. It's a true story. It's my story, except I add just a little bit of fiction.
Well, you are a magician by hobby.
It's a reporter interviews me and asks me a lot of the same questions you're asking me. And then this reporter turns out to be someone very special. I won't give out that answer.
No, never give out the punchline, whatever you do.
So that's my little touch of fiction to make it interesting, because let's face it, talking about suicide and rejection is one thing, but who wants to really dive into that? But I did get a lot of letters about, your book helped me out a lot. And so I did feel like my book was meant to be.
What advice would you have for business managers who have a person on their staff who has had a close person to them commit suicide? Is it you've got 2 days of grieving time according to company policy, or what?
Well, I would talk to my employees if I was the manager that that person who lost their loved one, and I would tell them, treat this person as if you would treat someone who lost their wife through cancer or any other misfortune that can occur. Don't treat the suicide as something that someone made a decision, because in most cases, people are in so much emotional pain, and everyone assumes that maybe they think that they could have helped this person if they had time. There's a lot of guilt involved with suicide, but I would encourage people to talk to the person, not about the event, but about their wife or their husband or their loved one that took their life, and talk about the good things in that person, because that person is so much more than a person who committed that act, and just talk. Don't shun them off. I definitely felt that shunning.
Now, another thing you can relate to, of course, is how you were off-boarded, I guess that might be a phrase, from the Catholic Church and your duties there. What advice would you have for managers, be they in a church setting or a business setting, in letting an employee go, even though deacons are not paid? So I guess you're a grand volunteer.
Well, it's a tough parallel there between business and the church. What I would do from a church perspective, I would remind them of the life of Christ, and I remind them that compassion is number one, and that having a relationship with God is important. And sometimes with the church, there's a little bit of following the letter of the law outweighs following the heart of the law. If a man's wife, dies, they created this rule in 1968 that he couldn't have another relationship or marry. I don't know about that rule and why it was created, but I think it needs another look. And I think you have to look at the person, and each case is a little different. As far as business goes, certainly today there's protection against that type of thing. You couldn't really let someone go just because they lost a spouse. But there could be an attitude that's going on in the workplace. So back to your previous question, I would talk to my employees and just tell them to encourage the person. You say he's still that or she's still the same person. They just went through a very serious tragic event, and it's hard to understand unless you go through it. But you can have some compassion there as well.
One other question and along this line, and that is for those of us who just know somebody who was in a situation such as yourself and is a survivor of a suicide. What should we do? You were rejected by a lot of folks, but what's the opposite of that? What practical advice might you have for those of us who know somebody but may not be overly close to them?
Right. I would approach the person. I would approach the person and express your concern for them, and ask them that, is there, a lot of people say, is there anything I can do? I'm here for you. But I would take that a step further and I'd say, I really like to know more. I like to know more about your wife or your husband. I would love to know, about your children. I think taking an interest in that person and encouraging them to talk about things other than the event that pervades that time frame is what I would recommend.
Why do you suppose people don't like to talk about suicide?
Well, they just don't know what to say. I mean, it's really it's an unplanned event. Obviously, it's not something that and when you look at the statistics today, suicide is incredibly it's on a rise across all age groups. I remember in college studying suicide, and I remember at that time it was predominantly with the young, 18 to 22, but now it's across all age groups, and there's a lot of types of suicide. Suicide is not, it's not. There's so many different types. It's not. Most people feel that, oh, this person has decided that they just can't handle the stress, but in so many cases they had no choice, and to understand that, and to understand that, don't make an assumption that the reason someone took their own life is because they were weak, and they weren't weak. They just it was almost as if it was a tumor that they couldn't handle. So there's a lot about suicide that, pick up a book on it and find out that there's a lot of different types of suicide.
And tell our audience the name of your book again.
Well, my book is The Deacon, An Unexpected Life.
You just happen to have a copy there. Oh, no.
Yeah. And you see, it's a man walking, and there's a lot of clouds. But through the clouds, there are these glimmers of hope. And that's really the essence of my story. It's not about so much the suicide, the horror, which was a chapter, the rejection, ministry of a deacon, but it was, a story of someone who held on to their faith through all of that. And sure enough, I met someone else who actually lost her husband after 44 years, not from suicide. And so we found each other. We're helping each other, and we're growing in faith together. And there's some peace and some light at the end of this, this clouds that people go through. There's just have to remain faithful, and things will happen.
And Tom, you have a website, I believe, and it is?
It's my name, Thomas Fargnoli, FARGNOLI.com. And on that site, people can learn more about me, my book, And they can even see me do some magic tricks. And they can certainly order the book if they would like. But I've done a few of my favorite magic tricks, which I do to usually accompany some type of scripture or something that I was teaching. So I always do something that make it more interesting.
And what would you like to add, Tom, that we haven't had a chance to talk about?
Well, writing was kind of new for me now, but now that I've written this book and it went over pretty well, I'm starting another one, which will be all fiction. It'll be it'll take place entirely in a tavern, and there'll be a gentleman in that tavern people go to for some advice. And so the advice he gives to various different people will be the essence of this book.
You've been watching the Bizgnus Podcast. We welcome your input. Send your email to editor@biznews.com. Thanks for watching.